Hello and welcome to today's convocation. My name is Sabrina Noor and I am a second-year political science student here at Concordia University, St. Paul. Jaylani Hussein's family immigrated from Somalia to Minnesota in 1993 and he is a trilingual in English, Somali, and Arabic. He holds degrees in community development and city planning from St. Cloud State University and political science from North Dakota State University. Mr. Hussein is currently the Executive Director of the Minnesota Chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations. He specializes in the areas of urban planning, community development, legal and civil rights, and youth development, with over 8 years' experience in working in youth juvenile treatment centers. Here to discuss the issues and struggles faced by Muslims in Minnesota, please put your hands together for Jaylani Hussein.
Congratulations on the scholarship, and thank you for such a warm welcome and introduction. I'm really honored to be with you all today to speak briefly with you about some of the challenges that the Muslim community are facing, and hopefully to have some dialogue at the end to answer some questions and maybe hopefully to talk a little bit more on that. I came to Minnesota in 1993, as was said, and I remember when my parents told us, my parents actually decided to come to Minnesota versus Atlanta. And we had a relative here. That was the main reason why we chose Minnesota. And one of the most interesting things was, as a young kid in Egypt, at the time before we came here, I knew that Minnesota was a very cold place. I mean, I could tell that it was far from the equator. And so I did this. I was like, so it's going to be snowing over there. So I would literally open the freezer in my Egypt apartment, stick my head inside and be like, so that's the snow there. And guess when I landed? We landed on February 16th, 1993, a very cold Minnesota day. I still recall as a young kid wearing this leather jacket, not meant for any Minnesota weather, but, and then it was cold in the luggage area in the MSB, and then it was cold in the car ride, and then we went to this apartment, which was 70 degrees, which is like an AC blasting anywhere in the rest of the hot world. But now, 20 plus years, I'm as Minnesotan as you can get. I actually get asked a lot of times, how are the new immigrants doing? And I say the day you land, man, that's the first day you start to become Minnesotan. Just from the weather, just from all of the other things. So that getting us started. I want to talk a little bit about my organization. You probably see us a lot on TV, and we had a pretty busy couple of weeks. Even yesterday, we're releasing a report on the anti-Muslim movement here in Minnesota, and you can look at that online if you get a chance. So we are an organization that has been kind of focused on really educating folks around better understanding Islam and Muslims. In fact, our mission is focused on this idea of educating and dialogue. That's really the crux of what we've been doing. I spend nearly 30% of my time speaking to groups like you across the state of Minnesota, talking about this community, talking about the Muslim community particularly, and some of the challenges. The work that we do at CAIR is pretty expansive, so we have actually a civil rights department that handles civil rights cases. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also media relations, particularly educating our local media professionals. Media plays a big role in projecting stereotypes and projections on communities. We are actually doing a research right now on media coverage of Muslims here in Minnesota, and we're doing it on the Star Tribune, the Pioneer Press, MinPost, and NPR, and the initial reports are not good. Maybe 60% of stories being negative from 2000 to 2018, average, and some of them even worse. We do civic engagement, so we're educating folks to get out and vote. In fact, Minnesota especially in the Twin Cities, has some of the highest voting turnout for usually disfranchised voters. And that's really a testament of the community taking a toll in that. And then training and development, talking to folks across the state. Just this Monday, I was at St. Cloud talking to HR professionals, and last week, 2 different groups. Youth empowerment, and finally Islamophobia. And the word Islamophobia is really anti-Muslim. So I'm going to start off by asking all of you a question I usually ask whenever I talk about the word Islamophobia. And it helps, I think, after answering it, gives us a little bit more contextualized and more manageable. So most people can explain to us what Islamophobia is. In fact, most of you will try to answer that question. But I'm going to ask another question. Why do you think it's happening? Answer the why question, and think very macro level. Just shout them out. You thought you were just going to listen, huh? What do you think? 9/11. What else? That's not the answer, but keep going. Huh? Ignorance. I mean, those are some of those would be what's still. That'd still be explaining what is Islamophobia. But why is it happening? Economics. Fear. Fear. Okay. So keep thinking about all those things and then step back one more. Why now?
Rise of
Influence. What else? Let me hint on something. Anything that's happening to the Muslims, is it new? Okay, so what does that mean then? What's the why now? That would be something, but like, okay, so you just said it has happened to other people. So what's happening now then? History is repeating once again. If you think of everything that's being projected to Muslims today, that is seen to be unfair, marginalization, the idea that Muslims are here to secretly change the United States Constitution. Catholics also tried to do that apparently, and it didn't go well. But everything that Muslims are projected to, it has actually been projected to other people. So if we understand that Islamophobia is actually history once again repeating, otherization of other people that we have done, especially from a religious standpoint, then we can start to manage a little bit that this is not a problem that we don't understand. In fact, we understand it very well because our communities, some of you sitting here and others, could actually relate to some of this based on your ancestries and some of the issues that you have faced. Once we start to understand it from that perspective, it's manageable, but it also understands that we all have a room in that. But the more we contextualize it into these little smaller things, the more we think we have to address that problem and this problem and that problem. And these are all the symptoms of really what history, once again, repeating. And those fears are usually manufactured in politics, manufactured in the media, and that has happened before too as well. So we have chapters all over the United States. Here's a little bit of picture of our civil rights report, and I'll talk a little bit about a couple of cases in here. So as you can see, these are cases that we usually are actually legally retention. So we handle about 1,500 legal calls a year, but only about 300 to 400 actually become cases. And so we have 2 full-time attorneys. As you can see from 2017 numbers, 360 cases. That's not usually what legal departments handle, but that's the nature of the things that we're dealing with. The biggest segment is employment-related discrimination. Usually this is what happens. This is a similar case that we've seen repeated often. A gentleman is working at a facility for 6 months, and during that 6 months, his shift starts at 6 a.m., and he never requested a time off for prayer at 6 in the morning. And then all of a sudden, after 6 months, he shows up and says, I gotta pray. And the manager says, well, for 6 months you weren't praying, so I don't know what this prayer is from. And what the manager doesn't understand is, it was summer and now it's winter, and the times of the day when the sunrise is happening is now shifted. So the prayer time actually shifted. And if they cannot effectively communicate that, they may then get fired for that. So we step in, obviously, and represent them. So we do a lot of education, especially, like I said, I was just at the HR Professionals Conference this past week on Monday. And as you can tell, that's just one of cases. So employment relations is a huge part. In fact, we're only representing people who are employed who then have an issue. We actually think there's much more challenges that happen pre-screening employment. Imagine a Muslim woman wearing a very loose clothes, shows up to a job site applying for a job, but everybody in that work site needs to have their clothes not so loose. And so you think that person can't work here because if they want to wear that clothes, for example, then they cannot work in a facility where there's conveyor belts moving around and things will get loose. So we say that's a problem, but there's a solution. And the solution is usually that person can wear something called like a lab coat. And if they wear a lab coat, then all of a sudden now their material won't get stuck into these conveyor belts. So, but what happens if she gets screened out of that job and that HR professional doesn't see a solution to a problem? And the law says that they have to be reasonable. And that's a very reasonable effort to say, well, we'll offer you a lab coat, or why don't you bring a lab coat, or vice versa. So employment-related issues is very important. And then the other one is government agencies. And the inflated number in here really is FBI. So in our community, the FBI just door knocks, literally. I know that sounds kind of weird, but if you just right now had the FBI come into your house, you would be just like terrified. First of all, most of you would probably be like, we're gonna call Billy the lawyer, our cousin, whatever, or somebody or a neighbor knows a lawyer, and we're not gonna talk. And that's what most people in America usually do. But if you come from a third world country, the secret police, you don't not open the door for them. And that's what the FBI are, technically. And in most cases, what we do is we just represent these individuals through the questioning period. And in most cases, I would say 99% of our FBI representations do not materialize to anything. There's no follow-ups, there's no subpoena, they're not part of an investigation, there's anything going on. In fact, they're just being technically harassed. So that's why that we have that representation is pretty high. We're starting to see issues at school, particularly at middle and high school, where bullying has now become inflated. Young Muslim girls particularly getting their hijab pulled, social media bullying, and unfortunately, I hate to say this, but earlier this year, we lost the first young Muslim kid to bullying as he committed suicide in Chisago County. And I see this across the state where young kids actually internalize Islamophobia. So I'll come and ask them, say, are you bullied? And they'll say, no. And I'm like, okay, have you had your hijab pulled? Yep. Did you get called terrorist and other things? Yep. So you don't think that's bullying? Well, they've internalized it. They don't see it as that actually being picked on. I've seen it even at elementary school where kids just see the hijab and they're like, let's see what we can do with that, right? Kids usually pull shirts and all of that, but now all of a sudden the hijab becomes the added piece. And in fact, it's an assault. And that's another thing sometimes, especially in middle and high school, administrators may not look at it from that perspective, but it's an actual assault. So that's an area that we're trying to do more. And in fact, we're going to be doing some surveys this year to hopefully identify how that's impacting, and then hopefully to do more around supporting young Muslims. They are very vulnerable. In fact, even the younger ones are extremely vulnerable to even language that sometimes would come. For example, if you have, during the travel ban particularly, we had the issue where we coined it as a Muslim ban, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these younger children, particularly elementary school, kindergartners, were asking their parents, so we are now banned? The idea of Muslim ban. So even these words, sometimes to children, means completely something else. My laptop will come back from frozen. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to particularly talk to you about today is what's happening in the state of Minnesota as it relates to Islamophobia. But before I switch to that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the other cases. So one of the other cases that we're starting to see particularly much more in the state of Minnesota is land use opposition. So a mosque wants to be built, and then all of a sudden there's an opposition to the mosque. In fact, most of the times, it's not the neighbors. It's actually some folks from a little further uptown who just don't like Muslims who decide that they're going to make a big deal about it and then turn it into a nightmare. So the last 2 or 3 mosques that have been opposed, but have been successfully moved forward. And then particularly the last 2 cemeteries that Muslims have actually tried to build have been completely denied. And it required a legal challenge to overturn it, or a threat of a legal challenge on one of them to overturn it. And I remember most particularly one was the Chisago County, the cemetery there. The applicants were actually European Muslim, so Bosnians, and they were getting 2 types of information. They would get the information of, yeah, we absolutely welcome you, and then another moment, oh, you're the Muslim group, so then therefore, maybe not, right? And the day when they're actually choosing to allow or to make the decision, one of the things that did take place was I believe, the commission, the county commissioners could not recognize that 90% of the people in the room were Muslim. Because 90% of the people in the room were Bosnian Muslims who looked like, Chisago County residents. But there was a lot of opposition, so they voted against it. Obviously, it's illegal, and it violates RLUIPA, which is a Religious Land Use and Act. And then all of a sudden, their actually lawyers had to tell them, we're not going to be able to defend you on this one because it's a clear violation of this act. So these are just a kind of example of some of the cases that we see. And I would say we're only seeing a small fraction. Most people are not showing up. In fact, when I go to the mosques and I talk to people, people will just randomly come up to me like, this happened to me. I'm like, okay, can you report it? Can we have a conversation? Like, no, but I want to tell you. I'm like, I'm not, I'm not the police. We need to document this information and we need to get it out. So a lot of the times, we know hate issues or hate crime issues are usually underreported. In fact, one of the biggest ones that gets underreported is Muslim women getting harassed. Muslim women usually get harassed all the time because of their hijab. In fact, one of the biggest ones, and why we're concerned about the tragedy that took place a couple of days ago, is Muslim women being driven off the road. That's something that has happened. It happened to my wife. It happened to other people. And so where road rage turns and sees, because they're easily identifiable, obviously, as a Muslim, and your car then can turn into something to threaten other people with. Other aggression. This is a video that was from a couple of years ago, and I'm just going to show you. You can kind of read through it. But this happened at a Walmart, right? And this Walmart employee is just really just frustrated the fact that she has to not work with these Muslim clients, customers. And she keeps saying that they own the world and they're running the world. And then she tries to look underneath to see if they're taking anything. And she's just upset. She's just really upset. And I know this could happen to anybody. But why would somebody get so upset about a group of people? And that's really what this fear and ignorance has led. In fact, I guarantee you, she probably has 5 Muslim employees, colleagues at that Walmart. She's no longer working there, but this is just to show you the type of aggression. And that Muslim woman did not report this, to my understanding. It was the bystanders who took this video, reported it, and I think eventually the woman was fired. So the word Islamophobia, I'm just going to go through the next slides pretty quickly, so if you feel a little overwhelmed, that's fine. We can send you the slides, and then so we can have a conversation. So again, Islamophobia is really anti-Muslim, and the word phobia, I think, is appropriate for certain perspectives because of the idea of irrational fear. So we see this on both sides, those who see Muslims as a threat and those who don't. After a terrorist attack, everybody's worried about the Muslims. And that's the problem. That's where the irrational fear is. In fact, if you look at the numbers, 97% to 99% of global victims of terrorism are Muslim. Muslims are killed by terrorists every single day. But we never raise the victims of Muslims. We always raise the victims who are not Muslim being killed by Muslims. And that's unfair because that does not tell the full picture of how terrorists are a threat to all of us. But that creates this fear where people start to project the idea that Muslims are the problem, right? Instead of the terrorists being the problem. And that's a big part of that. So this irrational fear then leads to people trying to be excluded, marginalized, and policies like the Trump's Muslim ban being implemented. As I mentioned earlier, history of religious intolerance in the United States is exactly being repeated toward the Muslim community. Everything that we talked about earlier about the casework, look at it being projected, at least just to these three communities. So the Catholics had employment discrimination, they had denial of public accommodations, organized discrimination, and then obviously laws, right? And the same thing, more severe maybe, in other communities. Yep, so just a little highlight. So here's a little bit of how this all works. So obviously ignorance of fear, some of you said, right? Ignorance of fear is a big part of how people project themselves toward others. And who is the players? Hollywood and media particularly, Islamophobia industry. Because of this ignorance, there's people trying to fill it. So if you walk into a Barnes & Noble, I guarantee you, you're gonna see a book, you're gonna see an anti-Muslim book first before you see a book positive about Muslims. You go to any small bookshop on an airport, you're gonna see the anti-Muslim book and you're never gonna see a positive book about Muslims. Because this is an industry that's trying to fill this space. And the book that I always get, people always say, come up to me and say, Jaylani, I'm reading a wonderful book. And I'm like, wait for it, just wait for it, wait. And then they're like, Ayan Hirsi's infidel. I'm like, ah. And then I have to work them back, like, no, she's an Islamophobe, okay, she's on the left side, that's why you feel a little comfortable listening to that, but, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's an industry, and then obviously organized hate. That's the other part where we're minimizing, and we have a report that just came out, I encourage you to read that. And then obviously hate crimes fall in between in that space. So all the reports say most Americans will probably know little about Islam in the United States. That's just the nature of the statistics today. Hollywood is probably the biggest portrayer bad information. You know, for over time, they have projected Muslims to be just savages and other things. In fact, many of you probably have watched Aladdin. I mean, just, you know, like read the actual lyrics. You'll probably realize, be like, oh my God, I didn't know. You know? Yeah, he says some horrible things about where he came from, we're savages or something. But so Hollywood has done that. So for example, today, the biggest community that gets threatened to, against being Muslim and gets threatened are actually not Muslim. Does anybody know? Sikhs. The Sikh men particularly wear turbans for religious purposes, but Hollywood has taught the world that Muslim men wear turbans. In fact, a small fraction of Muslim men in some parts of North Africa may wear turbans more often than others. But maybe some Muslims will wear a kufi or a smaller version of that. On the bottom here, it's actually a chart from a research that was done that we're basing our research as well, a little bit off of it. And it's a research on the New York Times. So most of us, if you read the New York Times, you say you're a kind of smart bulb. Probably you are. But for when it comes to Muslims, they compared it to other topics. And what they found out was all of the topics averaged around 29% negative. When it came to Islam and Muslims, it was 57%. So if you just read the New York Times for 25 years, you would come back with a slanted view of Muslims. The New York Times, not the, right-wing conservative blog or whatever. And speaking to that, when the media projects Muslims, when they invoke Islam and Muslims, what do you think is on their followed-up conversation? What is the conversation in context to? It's always international terrorism. Muslims are not invited to talk about taxes. In fact, TPT, where I show up a little bit more often, they'll never bring me on to talk about taxes and deer hunting, which I like to do, and other things. But when something bad happens in my community, then Jaylani gets the ring, and I have to go and smoothen the little wrinkles out a little bit. When Trump said that he's going to ban Muslims, most people believed Trump was really onto something. No, he wasn't. In fact, this was something that many people in the early primary voting completely agreed with him. 80% of the early GOP primary voters in the early states completely agreed with him. This was a sentiment that existed during the 8 years of Obama that we just could not see. The anti-Muslim organizing was extremely high during those period of years. And so what the 2016 election was just kind of uncovering what was already existing. Obviously, we challenged it. We did a lot of different things, but now the Supreme Court sided with his ban. Not fully, but sided it with it. And I mentioned this earlier, it's an industry, and it's an industry that fits both, I would say, political spectrums. So if you identify yourself as a progressive left or whatever, there is somebody for you, and if you're conservative right, there's somebody for you. And that's why it's harder for people to see. So Bridget Gabriel usually speaks to conservative right groups. She'll be on Fox News and whatever, and she says the exact same thing as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's on the progressive left. So Ayaan will show up on Bill Maher's show. She's identified as like a Muslim feminist. She's first of all not Muslim. She doesn't say she's Muslim, and also she's an Islamophobe. In fact, usually they didn't share the same stages, but the last few years they've been sharing the same stages, saying the exact same thing. So if you would be like, oh, Bridget Gabriel's horrible, but Ayaan Hirsi is like, no, it's the same. And if you want to have a conversation afterwards, I've had those, so I'm comfortable with them. There's a network of people, organizations that are actually pushing this, and I'm going to fly through this a little bit. This is the national group. We have our report that came out recently about the local groups here. 33 are inner core, and about 41 are the supporting group. And so these 74 put the talking points out there for the little moms and pop shop organizers in the state. And these are the people who go around and pitch their lingo. And just those 33, they're spending $50 million. $50 million annually. Their number one goal, to frame American Muslims to be danger. They're going to push all of that down the people's throat. As you can tell also, these groups, and they work very well with each other, and they use titles that usually don't identify them as hate groups or people who are spinning something. So the American Forum for Democracy, Center for Security Policy, I mean, that would be good on your paper, right? If you, Center for Security Policy said. It just doesn't sound like very anti-something. And that's where a lot of people sometimes, when they see this information coming, it's harder for them to see that these are the hate groups. They usually, so for example, as an example, this guy says a bunch of bad things, but he writes the bill, and then he gives it to these groups, and then these groups then hand it out to their local chapter affiliates, and that's how bills get introduced across the United States. So this is this anti-Sharia bill that it was introduced in 29 states, and it was actually 78 bills, but it was introduced and became law in 4 states. Obviously, the Supreme Courts of those states knocked it down because of its unconstitutionality. So in Minnesota particularly, what we see is hate groups / militias and anti-Muslim speakers, and this idea of refugee resettlement. This legislation toward refugee resettlement. These are the kind of the 3 mechanisms that we have identified. So this guy, for example, he goes around and talks about refugee resettlement. He's been doing it for about 4 or 5 years that I know of. And he's actually the one who's developed this talking points that now you start to see in St. Cloud. How many of you heard of St. Cloud city council member who said that he wants to stop refugee resettlement? I mean, they didn't come out of a vacuum, folks. These are the speakers who project this stuff, and he's probably has done about 30 events and about 4,000 people. This other guy just bashes Muslims, so just literally just bashes Muslims. And you can see even the headline here from Bemidji, Islam is a barbaric savage called Osama Duck-Ducktail's crowd in Bemidji. And the interesting thing is whenever this guy talks, usually we've had incidents happen in those areas. So in North Dakota, in Grand Forks, he speaks there twice. The coffee shop there, the Somali-owned coffee shop, gets bombed. In Bemidji, he comes and speaks there. International students, not even Muslims, international students then get harassed. So this information is meant to turn people against each other. There are hate groups in Minnesota. Obviously, these are recognized by SPLC, or Southern Poverty Law Center. But we are actually working with them to increase because the other groups are not in there, the ones that we have identified. And in Minnesota, they use unincorporated names. They don't incorporate, they don't have online presence, and they use funny names. So for example, how many of you know the bombing in Bloomington? The mosque bombing, right, last summer. And so how many of you know the Friends of Smith Park? Nobody knows who the Friends of Smith Park. But that's the group that has been blogging about that mosque for years. And their blog got picked up by the anti-Muslim circuit across the United States. Bridget Gabriel, who I showed you earlier, she put it on her website and everywhere else. And so all of a sudden this mosque became known to these groups. And that's how the target was painted, we believe, that eventually led these men from Illinois to come to Minnesota and bomb this mosque. And they use words like coalition for peaceful something. This is just a video I'm just going to show you. This is a militia groups, because the militias are a little different. The hate groups are paper pushers, I like to call them. They just like to come with the little papers like, look, 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 and then, you know, whatever, they show up. Militias, they don't show up, okay? But this is how they show up. And so this is a North Dakota militia group, and I'm going to show you here a little bit later. What they're doing is they actually have a makeshift model mosque, and they are taking targeted practice at it. As you can see, they have bump stocks, and they're shooting this little mosque, and it has TNT inside of it, and eventually the mosque will explode. Let's see if we get to the mosque there. That's the mosque. They made a little one, and they threw a little bacon on it just to add flavor. And then there you go, they're shooting at this mosque. This is from 2016. So militias cannot be ignored, obviously. So with that said, anti-Muslim legislation, refugee resettlement talk is really just a code word for a Muslim banned version of that, really, literally. I mean, I don't mean it as like a fake code word. It is the code word. They just want to, for the people that they're trying to project this to, they're trying to be extra nice to. And as you can see, this was a sign that was put up in St. Cloud attacking Catholic charities. Hate crimes, targeting Muslim women, I'm just gonna, pretty much most of us will probably understand, but there's been so many. Bullying particularly has been pretty high. The narrative around violent extremism is a big one as well. St. Cloud, there's been a lot of issues, as you know, but also there's a lot of positives that are coming out. People are starting to stand up and reframe. In fact, most people in St. Cloud are not bad people, right? It's just silence makes it that other people's little voices, you know, they resonate. You know, if you had 5 people of the same heritage and one person was saying something and the rest of them were quiet, yeah, they think everybody will think that those people agree with that person, and that's what happens. You can find our civil rights report that looks nationally across what's been happening, and then I will finally just say the best way to respond to all of this is to educate folks and to be an advocate. We have an advocate training program that we just started for people who are interested in doing more. We need to expose hate, as we've done in the Islamophobia report. And finally, we need to empower communities. And if everything fails, we do have a little drug that we came up with. Islamophobia. It's just gum. It'll spread love, and you can call your Muslim neighbor. And in the end, as great Dr. King said, you know, it's the silence of our friends that matter the most. So speaking up is critically important. Today, we are in a climate where we actually speak less than we've ever done before. We have more tools, but we speak less. And so to change that, we have to start speaking up. How many of you have been on a comment section and you did this? Delete, 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 and then you just left it. We do that all the time because we're afraid to put something out. So I tell you this, just put something. Don't think about it. Don't come up with the greatest line. If you want to come up with good lines, write them down someday as an assignment, and then you could copy-paste them forever. But for the time being, just say something. And one thing I would even recommend is ask the #1 question Minnesotans like to ask each other. You know what that question is? What's the weather like this weekend? That's it. That's it. If you say that, I'm telling you, most Minnesotans will just get on and, you know, forever. It's like the cooler talk. You'll just distract the entire population from reading this troll. But most people don't even read articles anymore. They go directly to the troll section, I like to call it. So if more people start to speak up, even if you put a smiley face in there or some other thing, or joke, I guarantee you more people who are listening and watching that won't feel so gutted by it. So with that said, let's start for Q&A. Yep. Thank you. And this is a safe room, so please ask your questions. Remove your Minnesota Nice filter for just for a second.
Thank you. With the Screamtown Dunn incident, I know he apologized and came out, but is he doing anything to educate? That's one thing I did look at the comment section and like, yeah, he's right. It's all Somali and things like that. Did he do any sort of outreach education to his Screamtown supporters after
Yeah.
the incident?
Yeah, so I talked to him about this. For those who don't know, Screamtown had an incident where the manager there, or the owner, had put everybody remember? I don't know, this story was pretty well known, but he said something about he's not gonna allow Somalis, or absolute zero tolerance for them, but everybody else, kind of play on your own thoughts. So we met with Matt. Matt seemed to be very genuine about his apology. He did tell me that a lot of people were coming out of the woodwork supporting him, and he was completely shunning that. And I think there's still some more room to possibly denounce some of that, and we're planning to do some training for him as well. So, but that usually happens anytime something comes up. You see all these people just randomly posting, and also sometimes they're not even from Minnesota. A lot of times from Florida. When we moved into our building in where we are in a church, at a Bethel Lutheran church on Franklin there, they had 1,500 emails that they got, and about all of them, 90% of them were from Florida. So the Sunshine State wanted to shine on us a little bit. Yeah, that's a good question. Second question. And by the way, just to your point, it's not just the screen. I mean, any story that comes out, it's like trolls will just come out, man. And they're very brazen, very, vocal, and again, I think, if we all went in there and we just put a bunch of smileys and we left, I guarantee nobody would know what they're saying. They're like, oh, there's a bunch of smileys here. They would just completely drown them out. But it's other people who feel like they need to interact with them. You don't need to have a discussion there. That may not be the best waste space of your time, to have a discussion with somebody who you don't even know what they look like. They have a page, but you don't even know if that's the real person, right? So sometimes it's really good to just not. In fact, I've been saying in fact a lot, but if in this case, I don't know if you remember through the Facebook conversation, the Facebook hearings, Russian trolls have been utilizing any of these little moments to add on. So other people would follow up what others said. So it might be a Russian troll who's like saying, yeah, Screamtown, yeah. And then that's giving some space to some people who wouldn't say it to add on to it, right? So these incidents are also taken advantage of by God knows whoever. I think back there, and then we have one.
Yeah, is what you're seeing in Minnesota, is that replicated throughout the United States? I mean, are we average, better, worse? Are we an anomaly?
Okay, that's a really good question. I think Minnesota is actually much higher for anti-Muslim work. And the reason why I would say is because we have a very visible Muslim population, and also a Muslim population that is obviously majority black and immigrant. So those two trifectas, are being immigrant, black, and Muslim, those trifectas really create this otherization that is easy to marginalize. Where if you had, for example, Iowa, do you know the majority of Muslims in Iowa? They're Bosnians, so it's hard to see them, right? It's like, where are they, right? That's the thing, so in Minnesota we have that. Also, Minnesota has a large percentage of Muslim population don't live in the Twin Cities. So if you go to Wilmer, Faribault, Owatonna, Moorhead, some of these larger places, East Grand Forks, other places where there's a large presence of Muslim population, we're talking about maybe 15 to 20%, much higher than even sometimes here in the urban area. So I think that's it. I think also the nature of passive-aggressive Minnesotans, we don't want to get ourselves involved, right? I don't want to be involved, right? That's the thing, and that's hurting us. Because most people don't agree with these anti-Muslim, they don't agree with them. But by being silent and not saying anything about it, you start to get them to be the leaders of the pack, and that's a problem. So one of the things I've been encouraging people to say is, just tell them, knock it off. Don't even engage them, just like, knock it off. Suzanne, knock it off. Just knock it off. That's what they said about the Catholics, just knock it off. I guarantee you that will go longer than trying to debate with them on an unintellectual process. There's a saying that goes, what's not reasoned in cannot be reasoned out, right? So if you were hoping that you can have a little beautiful You can have this in this space. This is college. You can have an articulate academic debate. And I've worked in higher education. Trust me, I know how to wordsmith to death. I went from Department of Ag. They don't wordsmith anything over there, right? And then to higher education, we were wordsmithing to death everything. But anyways, the next question.
Mr. Jaylani, I was going to ask, wouldn't that be the same thing if we just sit there and let them, have the conversation instead of, putting a smiley face and drumming them out?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that be letting them be independent?
I agree with you. I mean, you have to understand, especially on social media, it's a different conversation. If we're here in this gathering, we can actually have a real conversation where I'm checking out your nonverbals and et cetera. Online, it's about the next person. When the next person shows up to the comment section, they're not going to read every single comment, right? So if they just see something that it's not hateful, then they won't project themselves to that. Does that make sense? So drowning them out, meaning that if we all just said something, you could say something about the topic, but I fear a lot of people will get stuck in the writing. Like, I want to say this about this article. Well, I don't sound smart, so I better not say it. But if you say something else, then at least drowning them out. In fact, even that's the case. If somebody starts to, say something horrible, and then all of us start, singing, I don't know, some song. Is there a Minnesota fight song? No, there isn't. But I'm just saying in general, right? We'll just drown him out. No one will even know what he's saying. That's what I meant. So it's one tactic to completely. But I would say a real dialogue is a dialogue where two people are having a conversation. In fact, I'm working on a book right now on how to respond to Islamophobia, or what are the practical ways. And the first chapter is actually listen. So, sometimes we have to allow for these people to say these things, because what happens is if they're not allowed, they cannot wrestle with what they actually believe. So I had a woman come up to me one time and she said, Jaylani, I love Muslims, but I cannot stand about Islam. And I was like, okay. It's like, well, I can't really be a Muslim without Islam. And then I could just see her face like, oh, I didn't even think about that, right? So just think about allowing for people. Sometimes people believe things, but they have to utter it out. And then also remember, if you give a person an ear, they're more likely to give you an ear. And that's what you really want. And changing people overnight doesn't work. It doesn't really exist. What you're trying to do is hire them out. And a lot of people have learned experiences. I'll tell you another story. So I was in Bemidji earlier this year, and my car broke down, so I was there for a couple of more days. And interesting enough, there's an older gentleman that came up to me at a gas station, or actually a mechanic shop. And he said, you're that smooth talker. I was like, okay. And I was like, were you at the lecture? And he's like, yes, I was. I said, what did you think about it? He's like, I was one of the people who was there to counter you. So I said, okay, let's have a conversation. So we had a conversation. And one of the questions he's asked, he said, why are you all here? And I kind of got what he was trying to say. So I said, listen, there are more Somalis in Pelican Rapid, Minnesota than in the entire northern part of the state. Why do you think that is? He's like, why? I said, because Pelican Rapid has jobs for them. And they make a living there, and they live there, just like other people. And he's like, oh. So we continued to have this conversation, and the one thing he left me with was, first he started offering me a ride. After, the beginning it was smooth, whatever. He's like, I can help you, what do you need? And then he said, all we had to go by was what these anti-Muslim people were saying. So he said, why don't your people come and talk to us more so that we know more about you? So don't throw people away just because they come out very racist. You just never know what information they're working on. I had this similar example in St. Cloud, where a gentleman came up to me at this presentation, and he was like, I got a question for you. And I'm like, can you hold off until the end? And then later on I found out, I said, what is it? And he told me, you already answered it. He said, I'm an Irish Catholic, and I remember my father, the pain that he faced, knowing for the first time when John F. Kennedy ran for president that his friends, that he thought were friends, found out that he was Catholic, and then the discussions that were happening about otherizing Catholics. And he felt if that was the case and this is happening to you, that makes sense to me. So people need to understand. That's why I'm saying this is a return of just really old strategy of otherizing others. And it's easy. It's easy to otherize others. Yep.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm just curious, when people come up and tell you that they're reading Infidel, what book do you wish they were reading?
That's a good question. So there's a lot more books, right? There's What They Say About Islam, or what they say. I always get this book wrong, but so one book that I always recommend is Karen Armstrong. She has a number of books on Islam, so any of those books would be great. I think there's one particularly called Islam. But there's another book called Who Speaks for Islam? I think Who Speaks for Muslims? And it's Dalia Mogahed. And that one is a little bit more frequent asked questions, so it kind of goes through a lot of that. I recommend those. The reason why most people read Infidel is because that publisher pushes it. So they're right in front of everywhere. And don't tell this to Barnes & Noble, but when I go there, I just flip that book around. I'm not doing anything. I'm just looking at it and then putting it back wrongfully. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do it. One last question.
All right. Thank you for coming here. Yes. My name is Lee Paul Shaw. I'm the director of the Center for Hmong Studies. And listening to you describe some of the challenges you face, we faced the same thing when we came here in 1975 to 79. But anyways, the reason why many of the refugees came to Minnesota was because we have the resettlement agencies that were contracted with the State Department to resettle refugees where they had churches and also where there's jobs, like as you mentioned. Right. So my question is, what role have the churches played in countering this, right? The anti-Islam phobia. Because again, the churches were the one that sponsor families. Right. You have to go through. You have to be sponsored by by church or resettlement agencies like Catholic Charities, International Institute, Lutheran Social Services. So just wondering, what are the church doing to? So
Lutheran Social Services has done a program. They're one of the resettlers here in Minnesota. In fact, they resettled my family when I came here in '93. Lutheran Social Services. So they've actually done My Neighbor's Muslim program for churches to learn. I think what's been happening is the level of engagement is now outdated very fast. So I think we're going to hopefully encouraging more churches to step up. We've seen Minnesota Council churches put up the Blessed Ramadan signs, and we've had churches get emailed attacked and other things because they did that. Churches are starting to, but I think now what we realized in the 2016 election was it's just much worse than we planned for. So the aggressiveness, it has to be much more. And that's why we created an advocates program, because we actually want people to go out and talk to their folks about Islam and Muslims, but most importantly, talk about hate and the return of hate to this community. And I think that will play a big role. Finally, I will say, for Somalis here, majority of them are secondary migration. So they've landed some other state, because of the jobs. And we actually have a chart that the state demographer has, and the largest influx of Somalis came in 2006 to 2009. And that's the time when we had the economic downturn in this country. So there are still more jobs available for people to resettle here in Minnesota. But we have learned a lot from the previous immigrant communities, particularly the Hmong community. And there's still a lot of work to do. But Minneapolis and the Twin Cities is becoming extremely diverse. And that's, I think, very wonderful for the state and for this community. And so, good. Thank you very much.